Hi, welcome back to Gen Z Bible class. We're going to do something a little different today. It occurred to me the last class we had was actually, I keep track of the numbers, number 26. Now what that means is that we've been doing this for a half a year. And I thought this would be a good time to just stop and, not go through more verses of the Bible, but to just think about by way of review, what we've been talking about. Because, you can get involved in the Bible stories and the actual verses and things that you're reading about, try to figure out what's going on. But the overall purpose of this is for us to understand how the Christian worldview works in our life and how it changes our lives. And after all, that's the whole purpose of, Gen Z Bible class. Well, why, and maybe we should stop and remind ourselves, why is it Gen Z? Can anybody else listen? Well, of course they can. Any truth from the Bible is universal. It's, it can be applied to anyone's life. But just remember, the reason I'm kind of picking on Gen Z is because this particular generation right now, maybe in one sense is maybe a little more messed up than previous generations. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But also, you're at the stage in your life where you're making all these decisions, really important decisions. And these decisions are going to determine the way you live the rest of your life. So, when we began this whole thing, we asked this question, who are you? And I want to review that a little bit and think a little bit about that. When you think about yourself and your whole place in this world and your place in history, if you know anything about world history, it goes back quite a ways. All kinds of things have been happening on this earth. But the interesting thing about it, and especially as you read through the Bible, you come to see that even though, maybe thousands of years have passed, that people are still the same. And that the spiritual principles that we deal with really have not changed, but our circumstances have. So if we think about our place, your place as a Gen Zer in the overall world history, there's a lot of things that we all share in common, whether you're like a baby boomer like me or a Gen X, Y, Z, whatever, wherever you happen to be. But one thing that's going on right now is it seems like the world is changing at a much more rapid pace. So that we come to the point where we're looking at generations. 100 years ago, I don't even think they thought necessarily about your generation, my generation. We're all just people. But it seems like maybe it's because technology is changing, and in a sense the world does change. And it has ramifications on the way we live our lives and our social interaction. So maybe in that sense things are different. And I know for sure when I look at Gen Z and I compare it to my generation, and I think I think I made the point before that I personally have met people from, depending on how you do the math, 7 or 8 different generations, going back to my grandparents' days, who were all born in the 1800s. So I've, maybe my perspective is a little clearer than yours as a Gen Zer, because, this is the world you grew up in and you haven't seen anything different. But my perspective is a little different, and I think that can be valuable to you. But when we think about today and what's going on today and how your generation is different from other generations, how things have changed. I know certainly from when I was your age to what's going on now in the world. And just done a little research, and I've got some demographics that help us to understand a little bit about who you are and maybe why I'm so concerned that you become aware of what the Christian worldview is, because it can be very helpful to your life. I mean, that's the whole premise of why we're doing this. But, and some of these numbers are kind of shocking, I guess, in a way, but I found out that 18.8% of Gen Zers think about suicide. Now I know, people committed suicide back in my day as well, but that's quite an astounding number. And then even more astounding is that 8.9%, that's almost 10% of Gen Zers actually attempt suicide. And, in my generation, that was it wasn't unheard of, but it was just very rare. But that was really one of the shocking numbers to me. 10%, almost 10% have actually attempted suicide. What is this all about? Here's another interesting fact. For Gen Zers, what's the leading cause of death? Gun violence. Now, that's something that never even entered our minds in my generation, that somebody would bring a gun to school and start shooting their fellow classmates. But I think you really need to realize how much of a change this is, and how sad it really is that we've come to this point where people, and I'm not saying it's just your generation, but it seems like our whole country has adopted this notion that life is just not worth anything. So it's okay to go shoot somebody. That's a very sad thing. Another interesting statistic, 60% of Gen Zers have mental health issues. And I know maybe this goes back to the days, previous decades, when they thought it was a great idea to start giving children drugs to, control their behavior. I'm not so sure that was such a good idea. Maybe that has a little bit to do with these mental health issues, but I think there's more to it than that. I think that because we as a nation have turned our backs on God, it's led to a lot of this kind of behavior. I want to kind of draw the connection between the Christian worldview, and if you live your life by the Christian worldview, it's going to change your world. It's going to change your life. That's the whole point of this. That's why we're doing this. 45% of Gen Zers feel that the world is falling apart. I guess probably in my generation we might have had that same sense, but not to that degree. And then finally, and this is an interesting one, 80% of Gen Zers have feelings of loneliness, which is kind of a head scratcher to me, because you got cell phones and you're talking to each other and you're texting each other, but maybe it has something to do with this lack of one-on-one contact and communication. Maybe in that sense all this technology is not so much a blessing, and maybe there's some bad aspects to it. But why? Why is your generation so different? And on my notes here, I had this in parentheses, messed up. Why is your generation so messed up? And I don't want to give you the impression I think your generation is like a hopeless case. I know a lot of Gen Zers who really have their feet on the ground, and they're making sense of their life. But I think the reason is because many of the Gen Zers that I know allow God to put some direction in their life, and they're building their lives on these principles that we've been trying to cover as we've looked at the Christian worldview as seen in the Bible. So, but I do believe that as a nation, we've turned our backs on God, and this is something that, when we think about what we've been talking about in the story of Noah, and how in that very early world, those early days, men had turned their backs on God, and they suffered the consequences of ignoring him and walking in disobedience to him. So in that sense, nothing has really changed. When we turn away from God, when we try to do things in our own ways, and we go against the very rules of nature that God has created, we are going to suffer the consequences. And I would say that would be the underlying reason why this generation is as it is. So what I've done is I kind of thought over the different things we've been talking about in these last 26 weeks. It's just dawning on me that we're only about halfway through the book of Genesis, and we've taken a half a year to get there. Well, we were talking about other stuff as well, but I think what we need to think about now is doing kind of a review of how these Christian worldview principles affect the way we live our lives today. And by way of review, not just dwell on the stories that we've been reading about, the facts and figures about the genealogies and all this stuff, but what are the principles that we can glean from this? Just as we said, we saw the principle of living a life without God in the days of Noah, and that God brought about this flood to solve that problem. But I came up with 10 different areas of application, I guess you could say. Or if we're thinking about building a Christian worldview, maybe we can use the image of like building a wall. I mentioned I used to be a contractor, so I know what it means to, take these blocks and put them all together and, build a wall and build something. And those are often the very foundation of whatever you're building. That's the starting point. And so we are talking about foundational truths here. So maybe we can think of these truths as being like building blocks. And the first brick that we're going to put on our wall as we build our Christian worldview is the one that we talked about in the very beginning, that there is a God. In the beginning, God. And we talked about how important that is as a foundation for the way we live our lives. Because if you live in a world without God, we got into this whole thing about evolution and how, there's really no meaning to life because you're just this life form that happened to occur by chance. And, you can't explain your life any more than I'm just a really smart animal. This is not in keeping with the Christian worldview, that there is a God. And when we acknowledge that, it makes a huge difference in the way we live our lives. And then, so I'd say that would be the primary building blocks of the Christian worldview. First of all, that there is a God. I guess that's kind of a no-brainer. If there is no God, there is no Christian worldview. So, but the second thing was, and this is maybe equally important, is that there is a God, but that He is the one who created everything. So we're looking around, we're seeing all this stuff, and you have these explanations that all these things just fell together. And we talked about that. We got into some detail about, and if you want to review that, feel free to go back and look at some of those earlier sessions that we had, where we were talking about this idea of evolution and how, really, I have to say that I would call that one of the biggest lies in history. And that when I think about even myself in school, and that you were taught this theory of evolution as if it was true, and how we were able to knock so many holes in that as a theory, and yet they insist that that has to be taught, and that we can't talk about God and this idea of creation and Him being a creator. Well, I would suggest that that's one of the main reasons why kids today are so messed up, because that's the direction that our school system has gone in. And to the point, remember how we were talking about it used to be illegal to teach evolution back in 1928, and now it's almost come the other way around, that it's illegal to talk about creationism. Well, that's we've paid the price for that. So, but the second building block of our Christian worldview is that God is our creator. And that adds a whole new dimension to your life. If you know that there is a God and that He is mindful of your existence, not just that, but He created you. He made you. And that adds a whole new dimension to your life, because it reminds us that we have a direction, that we have a future hope, That's what God said in, I think the one verse we referred to was from Jeremiah 20, that God says that the plans I have for you are for blessing, not for destruction, but for blessing. And this is a wonderful thing to know, that we have a future in this very uncertain world. Remember, we said one of those things that shows up in the statistic is that Gen Zers they're feeling like the whole world's falling apart. But we got into this whole thing about how God, and we were looking at the genealogies and how we were seeing God's pattern within them, and it leads us to the conclusion that God is in control of all of these things. And all the kings and kingdoms that have ever existed, God is sovereign over all of them. And so a lot of the things that we worry about when we have God in our life, we don't have to worry about anymore, because we know He has them in His hand. And so those, I guess you could say, those are the first two building blocks. Number one, there is a God, and how you live your life based on whether you have a God in your life or no God in your life is going to be totally different. That this God is the God who created you, and for that reason we have a purpose, a sense of purpose in life. Remember, we were talking about that as well, that God didn't just make you as an organism to be on this earth to eat, sleep, breathe, and then die. That God has a purpose for every one of us. And life is not meaningless. There is meaning in life when God is a part of it. And so what we're going to do, and we're not going to go through, I have 10 different building blocks, I guess you could say, for building a worldview. And these are all things that we've already talked about, things that we've seen demonstrated in the stuff we've been reading in the book of Genesis. So we're going to be looking at them, and we're going to be talking about things like sin. Remember, Adam and Eve were deceived and decided to disobey. There was this curse, and we have free will, and all these things that we've been talking about. I want to kind of put them in order and just remind ourselves of what this Christian worldview is all about. So I thought this would be a good time to do it, as we're through a half a year, just to stop and think about what this means. But as we always do, we're going to leave with a good word. And here's a good word that reminds us about God's sovereignty, and it reminds us about the future that we have with Him. God doesn't just sit out there far, far away and have nothing to do with us. He loves us. He has a future for us, and He has prepared a place for us to go, even after death. And, that's one of the biggest concerns people have. Death, that's a scary thing. What's going to happen to me after death? And some people just, are paranoid about those types of questions. But when we understand that God is there, that He has a sovereign plan for each one of our lives, and that He has a destination for us, it just changes everything. So here's a picture of this destination that God has for us. This is from 1 Thessalonians, and the Apostle Paul is writing to the believers there in the New Testament church, and they're kind of wondering some of these details about what happens after you die, and what's going to happen in the future. And so he gives us this wonderful picture, this encouraging picture. And I'm going to read it now from 1 Thessalonians 4:16 to 18. It says, "For the Lord Himself will come down from heaven with a loud command, and with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet call of God. And the dead in Christ will rise first. And after that, we who are still alive and are left will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so we will be with the Lord forever." And he ends by saying, "Therefore, encourage one another with these words." So I guess if those words aren't encouraging, I don't know what words are. That we have a picture of what is going to happen in our future, and a picture that brings us beyond even the point of death, that we understand what happens after that. There's a lot more scripture that gets into more detail about, our eternal future, and that God has gone to prepare a place for us, and I think we talked about that already. But I hope this will be an encouragement to you, and I hope it'll be a good thing as we try to review not just the stories in the book of Genesis, but the things that they teach us about who we are and about who God is. And so I hope that this has been a blessing, and we've left on a good, encouraging word. And I hope also that you'll be able to join us next time as we continue on and talk about these building blocks of the Christian worldview. Hopefully we'll see you then.